They dumped his body beside the highway, a warning to everyone watching. On a cold stretch of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, a young Albanian man named Eros Grezda was left like discarded trash, shot in the head, abandoned on the roadside. No dignity, no goodbye, just a message. In New York's underworld, that's how disputes sometimes end. Not with court dates or apologies, but with a corpse placed where it will be found. That kind of brutality is exactly why, on this episode, Danny Gold and Sean Williams try to tread carefully. Their tone relies on gallows humor throughout the show. Danny jokes that the show helps Sean repay Lebanese Berlin gangsters. Sean admits he has essentially been running for months. Sean's even headed to New Zealand to let things die down, figuring if it was good enough for P2 and Kim.com, it's good enough for him. Nervous laughter carries an edge as Albanians become today's focus. Discussion centers on Albanian crews in Bronx suburbs. Their reputation hangs heavily over the conversation throughout. Danny, wanting to get out in front of it, lays it on thick. Albania is strong. Greater Albania. No smoke with Albanians in the Bronx and Westchester. No problems, no disrespect. It's half joke, half survival instinct. Because for decades, people in New York have repeated the same warning. Don't mess with them. Danny traces his own first exposure back to the late 1990s when he was in high school. There was a strip of bars in New Rochelle, just north of the Bronx, along North Avenue. The legend was that those bars were allegedly owned by local cops. Back when nobody cared about lawsuits, viral videos, or being called out online. Underage kids still got in, often using a trick that sounds ridiculous now. New York State driver's licenses had a surface you could write on with colored pencils. Kids would chalk the birth year, turn an 83 into an 80, and suddenly an 18-year-old looked 21. Inside those bars, Danny remembers Albanian crews, 17, 18, 19, constantly fighting, smashing people, beating the life out of strangers like it was sport. That's when the phrase burned into his head, "Don't mess with the Albanians." A journalist named Kevin Hellman, who later wrote a major series in 2011 about an Albanian crew, said he'd heard that same phrase even earlier, back in the late 1980s. He described seeing a group at the Westchester County Fair in Yonkers marauding, swinging bats over some beef, leaving chaos behind. Hellman's writing cemented folklore surrounding Albanian criminal notoriety. Stories alleged strip club shootings and hits tied to Giuliani. Tales included corrupt cops, Gambino intimidation, and Rao's demands. Florent Lenti Dervishaj loomed, linked to heavy weapons law. It's a lot. Some of it is exaggerated, some of it gets mixed up between different crews and different eras, but it all builds the same myth. These guys don't back down. Danny remembers another story from that same late 1990s. A Yonkers Bronx crew gets turned away from a house party, told to get lost. They later returned with 4 carloads of men. They cracked bottles over their heads, turning parties into emergency rooms. Even then, their violence felt like it had no off switch. Wild enough that, before long, people would claim they were challenging the Lucchese's and the Gambinos. To understand the reputation, they step back to Albania itself. It is a small Balkan country of 3 million people. Ethnic Albanians also live across Montenegro, Kosovo, and nearby regions. The modern story is inseparable from the country's trauma. For about 40 years, Albania was locked down under a paranoid Stalinist dictatorship, often compared to a European North Korea. Blue jeans, rock music, and even beards could be treated like threats. Hundreds of thousands of bunker-like pillboxes were scattered across the landscape. People were so isolated that when the Berlin Wall fell, many Albanians didn't even know for months. When that government collapsed in 1990 and 1991, Albania was among Europe's poorest countries. Then came the catastrophe of 1997. Shady banks promised insane returns. Some people were told they could earn 40% a month. The whole nation poured in savings. It was a pyramid scheme, and when it collapsed, the country exploded into riots and looting. Armories were raided. because the old regime had stockpiled weapons everywhere, and suddenly modern guns flooded the streets. Danny cites reporting that hundreds of thousands of rifles and small arms ended up in civilian hands. Italian peacekeepers, about 6,000, had to be deployed to stabilize the chaos. In a traumatized country with little money and endless weapons, murder rates soared. An Economist analysis framed it as the perfect recipe. The disbanding in 1991 of the Sigurimi security service left about 10,000 trained operatives jobless. The 1997 pyramid scheme collapse put guns in the streets, and the Balkan Wars created links between criminals, politicians, and guerrilla fighters, sometimes the same people wearing all three hats. By the late 1990s, northern Albania saw pervasive violence. Clan loyalties ran deep, making feuds part of daily life. That brings them to the Kanun, an old honor code rooted in the 15th century, built for isolated mountain villages where government law barely existed. The rules revolve around family honor, loyalty, and revenge. In medieval times, it meant knives and ambushes. In the modern era, it can mean assault rifles. Sean recalls reporting on a brutal blood feud. A man was stabbed over land, nearly killed. His brother killed an attacker. Survivor hid at home. Faces were burned, bodies pistol whipped, lives destroyed, because honor demanded repayment. Back in New York, a 1992 City Journal piece by Keith Elliott Greenberg described an Albanian NGO whose job in the Bronx was to mediate feuds, stamping out oaths of revenge and blood feuds in a single week. Greenberg warned that escalation followed once an Albanian man was killed. Male relatives were expected to preserve honor across generations. Danny mentions hearing there were even limits, like many killings in a feud, though the exact details blur in the retelling, another example of how myth and reality intertwine. Then the story returns to New York City, which has the largest Albanian population in the United States, often estimated around 150,000, concentrated in the Bronx, with pockets in Ridgewood, Astoria, Staten Island, and beyond. Albanians began arriving in larger numbers in the 1960s, often settling in Belmont in the Bronx, an old Italian neighborhood made famous by A Bronx Tale. Arthur Avenue still feels Italian, yet cafes host non-Italian men. Danny notes Albanians entered the pizza business early. By 1990, 35% of Bronx pizzerias were Albanian-run. Greenberg also described differences inside the community. Some Albanians in the Bronx came from former Yugoslavia, while other groups clustered elsewhere. He wrote about northern mountain clans and southern farming region Albanians. Rivalries between these groups often carried over into new settings. Religion was not the engine, as Albania remained relatively secular. Clan and village identity outweighed faith in shaping conflicts. Danny laughs off the weirdo blogs that tried to paint Albanian organized crime as some kind of extremist religious movement. The reality is simpler and uglier. Crime thrives where opportunity collapses, and violence becomes normal. By 1994, the New York Times was already writing about Albanian burglary crews turning theft into an art form. They'd travel up and down the East Coast, pretending to be tourists filming stores for folks back home, when they were really casing targets. Then they'd return, crack safes, and clean places out. Hundreds of stores were hit, with totals described in the range of $100 million. They met at social clubs, Arthur Avenue again, and law enforcement struggled to penetrate them due to language barriers, insularity, and tight loyalty. A detective named John Caprini described it less like the rigid Italian family model and more like Russian-style crews, separate leaders operating independently. The roots go back further. Danny mentions the Balkan connection, described in some reporting as moving a significant share of the US heroin trade in the late 1970s and 1980s, flowing from Turkey through Bulgaria and Greece into Yugoslavia, then out to cities like Rome, Brussels, The Hague, and eventually the United States. In America, officials believed some of that heroin was distributed by ethnic Albanians and Turks. In New York, an early major figure was an Albanian trafficker nicknamed Joey Lika. Operating more out of Staten Island than the Bronx, Researcher Jane Arsovska has described how his organization distributed heroin into Manhattan's artistic neighborhoods, like the Lower East Side, using fronts like stores and a travel agency scheme tied to Yugoslavia and Turkey. Lika was busted in 1981, but not before doing something that helped build the legend. He allegedly put out a hit on a federal prosecutor and a DEA agent, offering a huge sum. Danny's heard numbers ranging from $40,000 to $400,000, and trying to hire the Westies, the notoriously violent Irish gang from Hell's Kitchen. The Giuliani hit story is corrected in this telling. Giuliani was a prosecutor then, but the hit differed. The message remained. They would attack the state directly. The crew that truly put Albanian organized crime on the modern New York map came later, the Rudaj organization, also known as the Corporation. Its leader, Alex Rudaj, came to the United States in 1987 from Montenegro and began running with connected Italian figures. Albanians like John Allit and Zef Mustafa became known as Muscle, enforcers doing dirty work for the five families. Danny frames it like an old immigrant pattern. Newcomers start broke, desperate, and willing to go further, faster, and harder than the established powers. In 1993, a Bronx figure named Nardino Colotti, connected to Rudaj, felt slighted after being passed over for Joe Gambino in a gambling hierarchy. So Collage and Rudaj started taking gambling for themselves. Mount Vernon, Port Chester, the Bronx, expanding into protection money, extortion, loan sharking, and the unglamorous but profitable world of video poker machines. One federal estimate described at least 50 machines across Queens, the Bronx, and Westchester, each pulling in around $700 a week, roughly $1,800,000 a year in total. A single dice game could bring in around $67,000 a week. They weren't scraping by, they were drowning in cash. They also gained a reputation for reckless violence. Wiretaps captured Italian mob figures complaining that if you had a beef with Albanians, you had to kill them immediately, because there was no talkings, no negotiating, no calm sit down. Another mafioso allegedly said they'd clap a guy and the shooter would skip back to Albania, disappearing. Federal authorities aggressively targeted the Italian Mafia. This weakened the five families' control, creating space for outsiders. An FBI organized crime official described it plainly. La Cosa Nostra used groups like this the way they used the Westies, subcontractors who learned fast. That's when the corporation started calling itself the Sixth Family, demanding to be treated as equal to the Gambinos, Genovese, Lucchese's, Bonanos, and Colombos. And they acted like it. Danny brings up Rao's, the famous East Harlem Italian restaurant founded in 1896, notorious for its tiny number of tables and its celebrity mafia politician aura. According to the story, Rudaj wanted John Gotti's old table. When he didn't get it, he returned with about 12 men and forced the issue, an act that sounds almost comedic until you remember what kind of men were standing behind him. Then came a louder move, Soccer Fever, a gambling spot in Astoria, Queens, tied in different tellings to the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, or a Greek crew under Gambino protection. In 2001, a group of Rudaj's men, numbers vary in the retelling, 7 or 14, stormed in, pistol whipped a man, flipped tables, and announced, "The game is over." It wasn't a joke, it was a takeover. That takeover sparked a showdown at a New Jersey Turnpike rest stop, because in this world, important meetings somehow always happen at gas stations. The sit-down was called by acting Gambino boss Arnold Squitieri. An undercover FBI agent was present, which is why the details became known later. Rudaj arrived with about 6 men. Squitieri gave a signal, and roughly 20 armed Gambinos emerged. The Albanians were outnumbered. Guns came up, and then one Albanian raised the stakes. He aimed a shotgun at the gas pump and threatened to blow the whole place into fire unless the Italians lowered their weapons. They did. The moment ended without a massacre, but the humiliation stuck. Even if the timeline shifts in different accounts, the point remains. The corporation had gotten bold enough to face down one of the most feared machines in American organized crime. It didn't last forever. In 2004, after associates wore wires, the corporation began to collapse. Rudaj was sentenced to 27 years in 2006, but by then the Albanians were on the map, and new crews were already rising. The next wave was even messier. The Krasniqi brothers, Samir and Bruno. They were in their 20s when they were brought down around 2010, charged with a full menu: murder, kidnapping, assault, narcotics trafficking, robbery, extortion, arson, obstruction of justice, interstate transport of stolen goods. They weren't smooth operators. They were volatile. Yet they tried to look like executives, always in suits, always dapper. And they allegedly had a political connection too. An aide to Albania's deputy prime minister tied into their orbit. Sean isn't surprised. He remembers the village of Lazarat in southern Albania, long notorious for massive marijuana cultivation, where the state didn't fully move in until around 2014 or 2015, and the crackdown looked like a small war. The Krasniqis made money with robberies, strong-arming, and trafficking marijuana from Canada and Mexico into the United States. But their signature was cruelty, guns shoved into mouths, kidnappings, savage beatings. Their violence helped ignite a war with another Albanian crew in New York, one central to Kevin Hellman's reporting. That rival circle included a man known as Joko, who had begun his criminal life back in Albania, allegedly on horseback, robbing and pillaging in the chaos of the 1990s. In New York, Joko made money moving weed and ran with his own people out of the La Roma cafe. The Krasniqis grew jealous and decided Joko was soft after he backed off during a bar conflict. Then came the spark. They bought around 25 pounds of marijuana from him and refused to pay. Joko warned them. Samir dared him to say it again. The situation escalated fast. Gun to head, chaos, shouting, pride. Joko went back to La Roma and told his crew to prepare for war. They armed up, one man buying a $2,000 Uzi, and started moving from motel to motel. They got a tip that one of the brothers was at a strip club in Queens. Joko waited outside and had a clean shot, and couldn't pull the trigger. He'd recently lost a girlfriend he loved. He was spiraling, and the moment broke him. In this world, hesitation is weakness. Even his own crew saw it. The Krasniqis didn't hesitate. They launched a drive-by and murdered a member of Joko's crew, a young man named Aryan Shehu. With that killing, they seized control, taking over pieces of the weed game and gambling rackets. But then they stole from the wrong people. A 100-pound shipment of marijuana linked to an Albanian crew based in Toronto. The Canadians didn't handle it with threats. They hired tough Bronx Albanians, northern mountain-rooted men described as hardened by exactly the kind of clan culture Danny explained earlier, to settle the problem. The settlement was torture. Aronik Grezda, part of the Krasniqi circle, was kidnapped alongside another crew member and driven to Michigan. There, the captors beat them mercilessly for answers. When Grezda gave up information on the brothers, they still beat him half to death, stripped him, and dumped him naked in freezing Detroit streets. Another kidnapped man called Samir with the ransom demand, $350,000 if he wanted him alive. And in a move that showed how sloppy and panicked the Krasniqis could be, Samir called the FBI, an unforgivable move in their own culture. The FBI used him to set up a sting without fully grasping who they were dealing with, catching the bagman who came to collect money. The bagman refused to cooperate, basically telling agents they might as well kill him because he wasn't talking. And strangely, the investigation into the Toronto Bronx group seemed to stall. Back in New York, Grezda was shattered. He was losing weight, terrified, knowing he'd betrayed his bosses. He tried to fix it with a sit-down, urging the Krasniqis to pay the Canadians. But they already knew. They invited him over, checked him for wires, examined his bruises, and, according to a witness, were furious the bruises didn't look bad enough to justify what he'd told. They wanted to kill him right there. But an apartment murder is messy. Blood, screams, neighbors calling the police. So they ran a cleaner lie. They told him they'd go to Connecticut to pick up money, then hit a club. They never went to the club. They never went to Connecticut. They drove him out, shot him in the head, and left his body beside the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, sloppy, cruel, final. The Krasniki crew survived a few more years, but the collapse was inevitable. Between 2009 and 2010, the feds closed in. In 2011, both brothers received life sentences. Other crews rose and fell around them. A group called the Wolf Pack ran a cocaine ring and got taken down in 2013. Another figure, Retol Dervishaj, was tied to gambling rackets around 2013 and stood out for one reason. He allegedly had an NYPD officer on payroll as an enforcer, echoing earlier stories of Albanian crews using cops. That officer was sentenced in 2018 to 14 years. Dervishaj was sentenced in 2017 to 57 years. His name appeared in a 2007 shooting during a shakedown attempt on a Queens contractor. He was also accused in a 2012 Staten Island case involving a man stabbed to death at a bachelor party, though that case didn't go anywhere. And behind him loomed his brother Florent, an international big league name in Albanian criminal law. By the end of the story, Danny and Sean zoom back out. In recent years, they say, investigators and intelligence figures have warned the Albanian mob has grown into one of Europe's most dangerous networks, deep in cocaine trafficking, deeply involved in people smuggling, and highly visible in places like England, where flashy rap videos show off Maseratis and AK-style rifles. Danny delivers the simplest advice imaginable. Don't publicize your crimes, on Instagram, in songs, anywhere, because it always comes back. And after everything, bunkers and pyramid schemes, blood feuds and burglar crews, gas station standoffs and highway executions, Danny circles back to the same nervous joke. No problems with Albanians, Albania strong, Greater Albania, peace. Then they close it the way they always do, a hard pivot into support. They point listeners to their Patreon, patreon.com The Underworld Podcast, teasing bonus interviews, including a cartel money launderer and a former fentanyl dealer and gangster from St. Louis. And they sign off with the same calm words, like the story didn't just leave a body on the shoulder of a highway. Until next time, peace. Take it easy. And if you made it this far, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the next underworld you want exposed.